When I moved into Hawthorne Estates, I wasn't looking for a new beginning. After losing my wife Claire, I was simply for peace, a smaller house, a quieter life. Those tomato plants weren't just part of the landscaping, they were a promise. Claire planted Cherokee purples every summer for 22 years. I came to Hawthorne Estates looking for peace. After losing my wife, quiet was all I wanted. Then, on my second day, Diane Caldwell arrived.
Your property access has been suspended. Consider this your final eviction notice. You don't belong here. That's what the HOA president said to me at 11 o'clock at night, while I stood in my own driveway, locked out of my own house, holding flowers I had just brought back from my wife's grave. She had hired a locksmith while I was gone, changed every deadbolt, padlocked the garage, and then waited by her window to watch me discover it. She said those words like she was reading a verdict, like she had the authority to remove a man from his own home. She didn't. Under Georgia law, what she did was a criminal lockout, and what she didn't know was that for the last several weeks, I had been building a federal fraud case against her. Because I'm not just some retired widower she thought she could bully out of the neighborhood. I spent 25 years in the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and by sunrise the next morning, federal agents would be standing on her front porch, with handcuffs, seizure warrants, and a padlock for her mansion. But to understand how it got there, you need to know what kind of woman Diane Caldwell was, and you need to know what she destroyed before she picked the wrong house. My wife Claire died on a Tuesday in April, pancreatic cancer, 7 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. 7 weeks. One day she was standing in our kitchen laughing at me because I overcooked pasta again, and 7 weeks later, I was standing in a black suit I hadn't worn in 3 years, watching them lower her into the ground. People say grief comes in waves. That's true. What they don't tell you is how quiet it gets between them, how ordinary objects become landmines. Her reading glasses on the nightstand, her coffee mug in the sink, a cardigan hanging over the back of a chair, her side of the bathroom still arranged exactly the way she left it. After the funeral, the house in Falls Church stopped feeling like a home. It became a museum I couldn't breathe inside. Claire had planted Cherokee purple tomatoes every summer for 22 years. She treated that garden like a ritual. Seeds started indoors, transferred by hand, staked just right, watered at dusk. She swore grocery store tomatoes tasted like wet cardboard. She was right. That last summer, after she was gone, the garden sat there without her. The stakes leaned, the vines dried, the fruit split on the branch, and I couldn't make myself pull a single plant out of the soil. Our daughter Lauren was finishing her residency at Emory in Atlanta. For 3 months, she called every single night. At first, she asked how I was doing. Then she stopped asking that, because daughters know when their fathers are lying. Instead, she started sending me real estate listings in Georgia. "Just look, Dad," that's what she said. "Just come down and look." So I did. I found a modest ranch house in a subdivision called Hawthorne Estates in Gwinnett County. 1,800 square feet, a decent backyard, a 2-car garage, and enough room to finish restoring the 1971 Chevelle Claire had been telling me to complete for over a decade. It wasn't fancy. That was part of the appeal. I wasn't looking for a fresh start. People say that after loss, like it means something. There is no fresh start after 27 years with the right person. What I wanted was quiet, routine, a smaller life, a place where I could grieve without every wall reminding me what used to be there. The first weekend after I moved in, I planted Cherokee purples in the front bed. Same variety, same spacing, same wooden stakes. Claire would have approved. That was my first mistake. Diane Caldwell showed up on my second day. She pulled into my driveway in a pearl-white Cadillac Escalade, stepped out wearing a linen blazer over yoga pants, oversized sunglasses, and the expression of a woman who had never once in her adult life been told no. She carried a clipboard like it was a badge. When I opened the door, she didn't smile, didn't welcome me to the neighborhood, didn't introduce herself like a normal person. She said, "I'm the president." Not the HOA president, not Diane Caldwell, just the president. Then she looked past me into my half-unpacked garage, glanced at the tomato bed I'd just planted, took in the cardboard boxes stacked near the wall and said, "We have standards here, Mr. Calloway. I trust you'll meet them." Then she turned around and left. No handshake, no friendly wave, no "let us know if you need anything," just a warning. Later, I learned Diane had been HOA president for 9 years. 9 years in charge of a 112-home subdivision where the pool was rusting, the playground had caution tape on the swings, the front gate broke every few weeks, and the annual dues had climbed 40% under her leadership. But she made time to inspect lawns, measure mailbox heights, photograph driveways, and issue violation letters with the kind of enthusiasm most people reserve for birthday gifts. The first violation showed up on day 5. My Chevelle, parked inside my own garage with the door open while I worked on it, had been cited as visual blight detrimental to community aesthetics. Fine. $400. The second came on day 9. My Cherokee purple tomatoes were classified as unauthorized agricultural activity in a residential landscape zone. Fine. $800. The third arrived on day 16. My trash can, according to the notice, had been placed 6 inches outside the designated alignment point. 6 inches. I measured it later with a tape measure. She was right. Technically. Fine. $1,200. $2,400 in less than 3 weeks. I hadn't even finished unpacking. That's when Pete Harmon walked over carrying a 6-pack of Sweetwater 420, and the kind of expression neighbors wear when they've watched a bad pattern long enough to recognize the beginning of it. Pete was 62, a retired electrician, and he lived 4 doors down. He sat on my porch, handed me a beer, and said, "3 families before you got the same treatment." I asked him what he meant. "She picks a house," he said, "then she squeezes until they leave." He took a sip, looked out at the street, and lowered his voice. Her husband Greg runs some landscaping company that's supposed to maintain the common areas. But I've lived here 11 years, and I've never seen anybody but old Hector pushing a mower. I thanked Pete for the beer. I didn't tell him what I used to do for a living. Not yet. A week later, I replanted the tomatoes. Not because it made financial sense, not because I wanted to provoke her, because some things matter more than the cost. I got up early on a Saturday before the Georgia heat settled in, worked the red clay with a spade, mixed in compost, set 12 new seedlings in the ground in 2 clean rows. The soil was heavier than Virginia, stickier, rust-colored, but the plants took. Within 2 weeks, they were knee-high and reaching. Every evening when I watered them, I could hear Claire in my head telling me I was overwatering again. Then one Wednesday afternoon, I drove to Publix for groceries, gone maybe 90 minutes. When I got back, the front bed looked like a crime scene. Every plant was gone. Not pulled up, not neatly removed. Shredded. A riding mower had come straight through the bed, chopped the stems into green pulp, left deep tire tracks in the clay, snapped the stakes in half and threw them across the lawn. Crushed green tomatoes were smeared into the walkway. Dirt covered the concrete. The whole thing looked less like landscaping, and more like someone had gone out of their way to make sure nothing could grow there again. I stood in the driveway with grocery bags hanging from both hands, and for a second, I couldn't breathe. Not because of the plants, because of what they were. That garden was the one thing I had carried from my old life into this one, and now it was mulch. Carol Jennings from across the street saw the whole thing from her living room window. She came over before I'd even put the groceries down. "Diane sent Greg's crew," she said. 2 men on a riding mower. They said it was landscape remediation. Landscape remediation. That's what she called it. Destroying a dead woman's garden was remediation. I called Diane that evening. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she'd been expecting me to call. I kept my voice level. 25 years at the Bureau teaches you how to stay flat when somebody wants a reaction more than anything else. "You sent men onto my property and destroyed my garden," I said. "Your unauthorized vegetation was a liability to the community's visual standard," she replied. "I gave you written notice. You chose to replant. I chose to resolve it. You destroyed my property. I improved it." I let the silence sit there for 5 full seconds. Then I said, "Don't come onto my property again, Mrs. Caldwell," and I hung up. That night, I sat on the back porch with a beer and replayed what Pete had told me. 3 families before me, all pushed out, all squeezed until they gave up. That's when I understood something important. This wasn't personal, not in the beginning. It was structural. This was a system, a pattern, a method, and methods leave evidence. I went inside, opened my laptop, and logged into the HOA resident portal. Most people don't read HOA financial statements. They're counting on that. The documents posted online were bare minimum transparency, just enough to claim compliance. Annual summaries, vendor expenses, reserve notes, a few sanitized line items with no supporting detail. But I had spent a quarter century tracing fraud through financial paperwork most people would use to line a birdcage. And financial fraud has a voice. At first, it whispers. The dues in Hawthorne Estates had gone from $1,800 a year to $2,520 in 3 years. 40% increase. But the neighborhood wasn't improving. The pool pump was old, the playground was broken, the front gate barely worked. The common areas looked mediocre at best. So where was the money going? One line item kept showing up under grounds maintenance. Peachtree Premier Grounds LLC. Monthly payment, $7,250. Annual total, $87,000. For a subdivision this size? Ridiculous. I'd audited defense contractors who padded invoices less aggressively than that. So I checked the Georgia Secretary of State business filings. Public record, Peachtree Premier Grounds, LLC. Registered agent, Gregory T. Caldwell. Business address, the Caldwell residence, Greg Caldwell, Diane's husband. And the company was registered the same year the landscaping expense suddenly appeared in the HOA books. That's when my blood stopped boiling and went cold. Because I knew the pattern. Authority figure steers a vendor contract to a relative's shell company. The company provides little or no legitimate service. Payments flow out regularly. Records are controlled tightly. Anybody who asks questions gets isolated or punished. It's textbook self-dealing. And it works because most people are busy. They have jobs, kids, commutes. 1,000 better things to do than cross-reference LLC filings against HOA vendor contracts. Fraud survives on the assumption that no one will look. I looked. Lauren came down that weekend and found me in the garage, grease on my hands, laptop open on the workbench, spreadsheets next to carburetor parts. She looked at the screen, then at me. "You're not retired, are you?" she asked. I smiled a little and said, "Your mother would have had a field day with this HOA president." Lauren laughed, but only for a second. Then she put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Dad, just be careful. You came here to rest." She was right. I did come here to rest. But rest is not surrender. And there's a difference between peace and letting a thief keep stealing because you're too tired to stop them. The certified letter came on a Monday. Return receipt requested. I signed for it at the door and carried it to the kitchen table. Notice of intent to file lien. According to the HOA, I owed $4,800 in unpaid assessments and fines. If not resolved within 30 days, they would file a lien against my property with the county clerk. The letter was signed by Diane Caldwell. I pulled out my records. I'm the kind of man who keeps canceled checks. Claire used to make fun of me for it. Said I filed receipts the way other people collected stamps. But habits like that matter. I had already paid $2,400 in fines by personal check. I had copies. I had the bank clearances. I had proof those checks had been deposited into the HOA account. The number in Diane's letter was exactly double. Not approximate, not random. Exact. She had added my paid fines back into the balance as if I'd never paid them. Now, incompetence is always possible. But once you've seen enough fraud, you learn something. Dishonest people love exact numbers when they think nobody's checking. I didn't respond. That surprises people. They think if you catch a lie, you confront it immediately. Not if you know what you're doing. Premature confrontation gives dishonest people time to clean up. Evidence ripens. You don't pluck it green. 3 days later, I ran into Joyce Whitfield at the Publix on Satellite Boulevard. Joyce was the HOA treasurer, accountant by training, quiet woman, always looked like she was carrying a sentence she hadn't decided whether to speak out loud. She saw me near the produce section, hesitated, then said, "Tom, can I talk to you for a minute?" We stood between the bell peppers and the spinach while Joyce told me what she'd been holding in for 2 years. She had asked Diane repeatedly for full access to the HOA records. Diane refused. Joyce was given typed summaries instead of actual bank statements, expense recaps instead of source documents, no online banking access, no direct visibility into the operating account. "There is no outside accountant," Joyce said. "She keeps saying the accountant handles it. There is no accountant. She just doesn't want anyone seeing the real records. Then Joyce reached into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were partial bank statements, 3 months' worth. She had managed to print them during a brief window when Diane forgot to change the banking password after a software update. "I've had these in my car for 6 months," she said. "I didn't know what to do with them." I took the folder, and just like that, the case stopped being suspicion and became paper. That night I spread those statements across my kitchen table and stayed there until 2 in the morning. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator hum and the scratch of my pen on a legal pad. Claire's photo sat on the shelf above the stove, the one from Savannah, wind in her hair, laughing at something I said that I can't even remember now. I used to do this kind of work inside federal buildings under fluorescent lights. Now I was doing it in a ranch house in Gwinnett County with cold coffee and grief sitting across from me like a silent partner. The statements covered 3 months. Most of the transactions were normal: utilities, insurance, legal retainer. But one line repeated every single month: wire transfer, Peachtree Premier Grounds LLC, $7,250, sent on the 15th. Destination account in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Tennessee. That mattered, because the moment money crosses state lines electronically, you are no longer looking at a neighborhood bookkeeping issue. You are looking at federal wire fraud territory. One transfer can be one count. I checked property records next. The Caldwell Mansion on Magnolia Ridge Court had undergone a major renovation 2 years earlier. New kitchen, pool installation, granite paver driveway, expanded primary bathroom. Total permitted construction value, $280,000. I went back to the numbers. Peachtree Premier had received $87,000 a year from the HOA for 4 straight years. $347,000 total. Old Hector, the man who actually mowed most of the common areas, was probably getting paid under the table a fraction of that, meaning the rest was disappearing. Then I found Greg's prior civil filings from a contractor dispute. In those records, Greg described Peachtree Premier Grounds as inactive, no operating revenue. Inactive. Meanwhile, the HOA was wiring that company $87,000 a year like clockwork. That wasn't sloppy accounting. That was tax fraud. By the time I leaned back from the table, I had the shape of the whole scheme. HOA dues from 112 families flowed into the association account. Diane controlled disbursements. Money moved to Greg's shell company. Minimal services were performed. Personal assets improved. Income went unreported. Wire fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy. And because Diane was a fiduciary handling community funds, the state-level penalties were going to get uglier. I picked up Claire's photo and said, "She picked the wrong house, sweetheart." Then I opened a fresh document and wrote the kind of memo I hadn't written since I retired. Clean formatting, source citations, chronology, supporting exhibits. No drama, just facts. That's how the best cases get built. The next morning I called Sandra Voss. Voss and I had worked together for 11 years. Sharp agent, white-collar specialist, transferred to Atlanta a few years earlier. When she answered, she said, "Tom Calloway, I heard you retired." "I did," I said. "Then I moved into an HOA fraud case." She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she asked, "How solid is the paper?" That's the right question. Not how angry are you, not how bad is the neighbor, not do you have a personal grudge. How solid is the paper? I told her. Interstate wire transfers, shell company registered to the husband, hidden bookkeeping, board treasurer willing to cooperate, property improvements matching missing funds, tax inconsistencies. She said, "I'll be there in 40 minutes. Voss arrived in a dark sedan, sleeves rolled, no wasted motion. She sat at my kitchen table and read everything. The bank statements, the LLC records, the property permits, the timeline, the lien letter, the flow chart, the notes from Joyce. 20 minutes later, she looked up and said, "This is cleaner than half the cases my unit builds in 6 months." That's when I knew Diane's problem had become real. Voss brought in the U.S. Attorney's office. An assistant U.S. attorney named Nathan Holt reviewed the package. Mid-30s, former military, lean, focused, not interested in grandstanding. He asked me two things. Can you prove Diane personally authorized the disbursements? Yes. The bylaws required her signature on all payments above $500. Do you have a cooperating insider? Yes. Joyce Whitfield. That was enough to start moving. IRS criminal investigation came in next on the tax side. They loved Greg's paperwork, because criminals who lie to everybody often forget they also lied to the IRS in writing. Within weeks, a federal grand jury returned a sealed indictment. Diane and Greg Caldwell. Arrest warrants, asset seizure warrant, bank account freezes, sealed, waiting. And while all of that was sitting quietly in a federal clerk's office, Diane was still driving around the neighborhood in her Escalade, acting like she owned the air. She didn't know about the indictment, but she knew something had changed. I think it was because I stopped reacting. I stopped arguing over fines, stopped defending myself at meetings, stopped giving her the emotional return she wanted. That made her nervous. People like Diane need feedback. They need the flinch, the frustration, the visible shrinking of the target. When that disappears, they escalate. She called an emergency board meeting. Same rubber stamp quorum. Same two people who never voted against her. They suspended my access to the neighborhood irrigation system over unresolved assessment disputes. 2 days later, my water line was shut off. Georgia in July is not forgiving. The heat sits on your chest. The air feels chewable. The clay splits open if you look at it too long. Within days, my lawn started dying. By day 12, another violation letter arrived. Failure to maintain landscaping. Fine, $300. She cut my water, then fined me because the lawn died without water. That kind of cruelty isn't accidental. It's deliberate craftsmanship. Then she started working the neighborhood. Pete came over one morning and told me Diane had been going door to door saying I was litigious, unstable, a threat to everyone's dues, the kind of homeowner who would drag the whole community into expensive lawsuits. Some people believed her. Some people didn't. But that wasn't the point. The point was isolation. A woman who once brought me a casserole crossed the street to avoid my house. A couple I used to wave to suddenly found the sky fascinating whenever I stepped outside. Then Diane's personal attorney sent me a cease and desist letter. Not the HOA attorney, her own. It accused me of harassment, defamation, and interference with HOA governance. Demanded that I stop asking questions about the association's finances. Threatened civil action if I continued. I read it twice, folded it neatly, placed it in the evidence folder. In my old line of work, we had a phrase for a document like that: consciousness of guilt. Because innocent people usually don't send legal threats demanding that others stop looking at public records. The sealed indictment sat downtown. The case was ready. And still Diane couldn't help herself. She had to keep pushing. Then came the anniversary of Claire's death. 1 full year. Lauren asked if I wanted company. I told her no. Some grief gets heavier when witnessed. I bought magnolias from a florist on Buford Highway. Claire loved magnolias. Said they smelled like lemon, sugar, and southern air. I drove to the cemetery and sat with her stone for 2 hours. I told her about the Chevelle, how I'd nearly finished the wiring harness. I told her I'd replanted tomatoes in the backyard this time, where Diane's people couldn't reach them. I told her about Pete, about how Georgia's sunlight hit the yard in the evenings, about the silence, about missing her in all the stupid little ways that never make it into sympathy cards. I didn't tell her about the case. I didn't need to. Claire used to say I couldn't sit in a room with a crooked picture frame without straightening it. By the time I drove home, it was late, a little after 11. I pulled into my driveway. The porch light was off. I always left the porch light on. That was the first sign. I walked to the front door, put my key into the deadbolt, and it stopped halfway. Wouldn't turn. I checked the key, tried again. Nothing. Went to the back door. Different lock. Same problem. Then I checked the garage. Padlocked. Heavy brass padlock. Brand new. Every entry point had been changed. I stood there in my own driveway, holding funeral flowers and staring at a house I owned, but could not enter. Then across the street, a second-floor light came on. Diane's window. She had been waiting. A minute later, she stepped onto her porch in a silk robe and slippers, arms folded, chin up, the whole posture of a woman convinced she was about to deliver a final humiliation. "The board voted this afternoon, Mr. Calloway," she called out. "You've been declared in default. Your property access has been suspended pending resolution of all outstanding assessments." Then she paused, because some people enjoy their lines more if they think you'll remember them forever. "Consider this your final eviction notice. You don't belong here." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I understood something. She had spent 9 years bullying people who only knew how to fight emotionally. She had never gone after somebody who knew how to fight institutionally. I set the magnolias on the hood of my truck and made 2 phone calls. The first was to the sheriff's department. Illegal lockout, no court order, document it. The second was to Sandra Voss. "She changed the locks," I said. "Can you move the warrant up to tomorrow morning?" Voss didn't hesitate. "I'll make the call." Deputy Kyle Stanton arrived at 11:40. Young guy, professional. Took one look at the changed deadbolts in the padlocked garage and said exactly what I wanted on record. "Sir, this is illegal." He called an emergency locksmith. 20 minutes later, I was back inside my own home. Deputy Stanton wrote his report at my kitchen table while I put the magnolias in a vase where Claire's flowers used to go. Before he left, he said, "I don't know what's going on between you and your HOA, but what she did tonight is a crime." "Yes," I said, "it is." Then the house got quiet again. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with coffee and watched the clock. 3 o'clock. 4. 4:30. First birds outside. Then the sky turning from black to charcoal to thin amber. At 5:42 in the morning, I heard engines. Not one, several. Low V8 rumble, controlled speed, government convoy pace. I walked to the window. 3 black SUVs turned onto Magnolia Ridge Court, followed by 2 gray sedans. No sirens, no drama, just purpose. The convoy passed my house and stopped in front of the Caldwell mansion. I saw Sandra Voss in the lead vehicle. She looked toward my porch and gave me a single nod. That was all. Then doors opened. Agents stepped out in tactical vests. IRS investigators in windbreakers. Nathan Holt in a suit. Everybody moving with the calm efficiency of people who already know exactly how this morning ends. Voss walked up the granite paver driveway Greg had paid for with stolen HOA money and knocked. "FBI, open the door. We have a federal warrant." Lights came on inside. A moment later, the door opened, and Diane Caldwell stood there in a white silk nightgown, barefoot, half awake, trying to understand why federal agents were standing on her porch before sunrise. Voss held up the warrant. "Diane Caldwell, I'm Special Agent Sandra Voss with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest and a federal seizure order for this property and all associated assets." Greg appeared behind her in a t-shirt and boxer shorts, already wearing the expression of a man hoping confusion might count as a defense. It didn't. Agents moved in. Wrists were secured. Handcuffs clicked. Greg said, "There's been a mistake." Nobody bothered answering. Diane was louder. "You can't do this. This is my house. I'm the president of this homeowners association." That line would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. Voss looked at her and said, "Ma'am, the United States doesn't recognize HOA titles." That was the moment it ended. An agent replaced the front lock. A federal seizure notice went on the door. Property seized by the United States of America. The same woman who had locked me out of my home a few hours earlier was now being removed from hers by federal authority. And by then, the neighborhood was awake. Porch lights flicked on all down the block. Pete stood on his lawn in pajama pants holding a coffee mug like he'd forgotten how hands worked. Joyce was crying at the edge of her driveway. A couple of neighbors drifted toward the sidewalk. Somebody yelled, "About time!" Diane was walked to the SUV in handcuffs, silk nightgown catching the morning light. No clipboard, no sunglasses, no authority, just fear. She turned once before getting into the vehicle and looked across the street at me. I stood on my porch with a coffee cup in my hand, and for the first time since I'd met her, Diane Caldwell looked exactly like what she was. Not a president, not a power broker, not a ruler of anything, just a thief who had finally run out of distance. I took a sip of coffee, didn't say a word. Deputy Stanton pulled up just as the convoy was preparing to leave. He looked at the mansion, then at Diane in the back of the SUV and said, Guess she got her locks changed after all. That was the first real laugh I'd had in a long time. Once the arrests went public, everything moved quickly. The federal indictment charged Diane with multiple counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement-related offenses. Greg caught tax charges and fraud conspiracy counts of his own. Their attorney tried to slow it down. Continuances, delay tactics, predictable stuff. Didn't matter. The mansion was sold at federal auction months later. Vehicles seized, bank accounts frozen, recovery funds established for the homeowners. And suddenly, for the first time in years, Hawthorne Estates started looking like a neighborhood instead of a hostage situation. Joyce Whitfield was elected HOA president in a special election by a landslide. Her first move was to hire an independent auditor. Her second was to lower the annual dues. Her third was to fire Peachtree Premier Grounds and hire a legitimate landscaping company with actual staff, actual equipment, and actual schedules. The pool got fixed. The playground got repaired. The gate started working consistently. Old Hector, the man who had been doing most of the real labor while the Caldwells pocketed the difference, got hired properly with better pay and benefits. Pete said it was the first time the HOA felt like it belonged to the homeowners. He was right. As for me, I used part of the restitution and support from the new board to create something Claire would have loved. The empty lot behind the pool had sat untouched for years. Quarter-acre of clay and weeds. We cleared it, leveled it, built raised beds. 40 of them. I built the frames myself out of cedar. Lauren came down for the opening weekend with basil, wine, and an old photo of Claire kneeling in our Virginia garden, with dirt on her knees and sunlight in her eyes. We hung the photo inside the shed. In the first bed, I planted Cherokee purple tomatoes. Of course I did. And on the post beside them, we mounted a small bronze plaque. In memory of Claire Calloway, who believed every garden starts with one seed. That afternoon, Lauren and I sat at a picnic table I'd built from leftover cedar and ate tomatoes straight off the vine, juice down our wrists, seeds on our shirts, no one caring. She smiled and said, "Mom would have loved this." I told her, she's the one who planted it. Because in a way, she had. Here's the part I want you to remember. People like Diane Caldwell survive because most decent people assume somebody else is checking. Somebody else is reading the numbers. Somebody else is asking questions. Somebody else is making sure the person in charge isn't using that position as a license to steal. But a title does not make someone trustworthy. An HOA president is a fiduciary. That means they are legally obligated to handle community money honestly. And if your dues keep going up while your neighborhood keeps falling apart, if vendor contracts always seem to lead back to friends or family, if records are hidden, if questions are punished, if intimidation replaces transparency, that is not leadership. That is a warning sign. Check the public records. Search the business filings. Compare the names. Follow the paper. Fraud is rarely invisible. Most of the time, it's just counting on your exhaustion. Diane Caldwell thought she was untouchable because she had spent 9 years confusing fear with authority. Then she changed the locks on the wrong widower. I still live in Hawthorne Estates. I finished the Chevelle. Candy apple red, Claire's color choice. On Saturday mornings, I drive it down to the community garden, water the beds before the heat rises, and listen to the neighborhood wake up around me. Kids laughing, sprinklers hissing, gate working, people waving, and nobody changes my locks.